Today we're going to be looking at the African American experience in the Gilded Age. And unfortunately, the way that US history is frequently shaped in the mainstream narrative, the African American experience ends, in a sense, with the end of Reconstruction. Now, if you don't know much about Reconstruction, Reconstruction was a period after the Civil War, approximately from 1865, when the war ended, to 1877, so a period of about 12 years. And this is a period when, after the war was over, the white South pretty much refused to incorporate African Americans into their society in any way whatsoever. So the North went down. This was done with the backing of the Northern armies. And they basically tried to push a system of government onto the white South, which included a whole lot of racial reforms, including full civil rights for blacks, schools for blacks, full political participation. Because the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, was a Northern party and had won the war, they tried to make the Republican Party, build the Republican Party around the African American populations in the South, which in many areas were, if not the majority, in places like South Carolina, then a substantial minority, and they thought they could build a new government around them. And so this was both, in some ways, self-serving for the Northern whites to do this, because in many cases what they were asking for in the South was way more radical than anything they were willing to do in their own area of the country. So there was this sort of desire to end slavery and end the system of oppression in the South without really looking about what it meant to Black people in the North. So what's important about this is there was a period of time for about 10 years when African Americans were making real strides. And what they did, what any free people would do, they began to build colleges. And so historically Black colleges and universities are built in this period. You notice that both Howard and Morehouse, two very famous historically Black colleges, are built shortly after the war. And this is done primarily with the support of the Northern African American community and with their liberal white allies. And so these schools, when I look at the long-term goal, or when I say you need to look at it, I think it's pretty clear. The idea here is to build a middle class and highly educated class of African American students who can go and then extend the education into the larger population and to build wealth and to do all the things that free people could do. So there was momentum building under Reconstruction. Blacks were serving on juries, blacks were voting, blacks were making fairly substantial progress. It really was a civil rights movement. And then, of course, what happened in the 1870s was eventually the North got tired of all of the work they had to do to make this possible, and it also cost a lot of money as well. And there was a certain amount of corruption in the Southern Reconstruction governments. And eventually the Democrats, the Southern Democrats, which was the party of the white South, came back and defeated the Republicans at the ballot box, did so by, as you can see here, voter intimidation. There were poll watcher groups that were coming and making sure that blacks didn't vote, as you can see here, preventing blacks from voting or making them vote Democratic. So basically you had a counter-reaction against African American advances. Now, in the Gilded Age, obviously, generally narrative as well, African American advancements ended, and then it's all about economic growth. But there are other things that are happening, and if you look at the way that African Americans depict themselves, this is obviously the first one is from the homework that you did on the left from a little bit later, but if you look at the way that African Americans depict themselves in their artwork, it's going to show you something about the self-perception, which I think is very important. And I want you to pause for a second, pause the video, and think about for a second, what do these two images tell you about the nature of the African American experience and the relationships in families and so forth during the Gilded Age? Now, another thing that happens as a result of African Americans being pushed back down after Reconstruction is the establishment of something called sharecropping. Slavery was outlawed because of the 15th Amendment, so it was illegal to enslave people. But quickly, Southerners moved from slavery to something called sharecropping. And sharecropping was a system where African Americans were given a title to land. So they were given a portion of land and allowed to work it. But they then had to buy all of their products from white markets and borrow money from white people when they needed to. And almost immediately, black people went into debt. And when they went into debt, they then were unable to do anything other than continue to work the land. And so when I say, is this better or worse or the same as slavery, in many cases they were working the exact same land that their families had worked generations before them, except for they didn't have the protection that slavery offered. And by that I mean that at least the slave owner had some economic investment in them as laborers, and therefore if they got sick or hurt, the slave owner was in his interest to help them. Whereas here, if they got hurt or something bad happened, they just went into debt and eventually would go to prison. And so in some ways, you can just think about, yes, they're free, but they're free only in name only. They don't really have any kind of economic freedom. So as the reading said, not only were half of blacks during the Gilded Age working in agriculture, another third were working in domestic service, and that obviously included mainly women. So here you see two different views of the African American woman. One from the left, which is more the white perspective and the mammy stereotype of the older, dutiful, happy, black, servile woman. And I want you to think about why that might be the image that white people wanted to project versus the real experience of the African American domestic on the right. Obviously, she's not saying anything directly, but you perhaps, if you read her look or what's behind her look, you'll get something that's closer to this. So I want you to pause this slide and read this. And again, what is the point that's being made here about the experience of, again, what were referred to then as Negro women, black women. Again, the condition of this vast host of poor colored people is just as bad as, if not worse than, it was during the days of slavery. We are literally slaves. So working long, long hours with for white people, raising white children just as black women did during slavery. And there's a very clear sense in which there had not been a lot of progress made. Now, for men, not only was sharecropping leading to debt, but debt led to prison, and large numbers of African American men were imprisoned for the failure to pay their debts. And convict leasing was basically the process where African American men who were arrested and imprisoned were then forced to work while in prison for basically nothing. They were hired out by the prisons and forced to work the land for no wages. And frequently they were working, again, the same land that their ancestors had worked. So this was a form of slavery by another name. And perhaps shockingly, at least I hope it's shocking to you, this system still exists. There's still a system where in the South where the disproportionate number of prisoners are black are still leased out. And these days they work for wages that are usually less than $1 an hour to work very hard manual labor. And it's stunning that this continues to exist. But again, a process that began 150 years ago is still going on today. Now, in response to this, you had educators like Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver, who were from the Deep South, who suggested that African Americans needed to understand that segregation wasn't going away, and therefore they had to work themselves in a self-sufficient way to form schools that would allow them to better able to get industrial jobs. So Booker T. Washington, who was himself an enslaved person, who had to walk 500 miles just to get an interview at the school that he went to, learned that industrial education and job training was perhaps a better way for the Southern black person to go, because it allowed them to get jobs immediately. And again, this idea of lifting your bucket where you are, take advantage of the opportunities that you have where you are. So Tuskegee Institute wasn't just built by African Americans who learned through the process of building their school carpentry skills and building skills and engineering skills. They were then going out into their communities and making money. So on one side, you had this industrial education model, which George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington were recommending. And then you also had a group of people who were extended from this, the National Negro Business League, which was the idea that you would have coalitions and groups of black businessmen that would work together to create basically a black economy that would work alongside the white economy. And there were enough prosperous black people to support this type of economy. And the idea was to build business owners and communities of business owners who would help lift the black community up as they themselves made more money. Now, while Booker T. Washington was a force in the South, in the North, you had W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois, notice his nice high forehead, a sign always of his great good looks and incredible intelligence. In this case, his intelligence really was incredible. He was the first PhD, black PhD from Harvard University. He was truly one of the great intellectuals of the early 20th century. And perhaps even more amazing because he grew up in the North in an area, Great Barrington, which was largely white. He was one of the only black kids in his school. And he spent time not only at Harvard University, but in the great universities of Europe. And he felt like the way the black community should advance itself was through something called the talented 10th. So he wanted African Americans to focus on jobs like doctors and lawyers, teachers, and basically to create an upper class that would allow for more African American uplift. So these two approaches, Booker T. Washington of lifting from below, lifting from industrial work, was one way to go, and the flip side was Du Bois, who wanted to lift from above with these sorts of jobs. Now, by the end of the century and the early part of the 20th century, you have very prosperous black communities, and you can see some of them here, whether it was the Greenwood area of Tulsa, which was known as Black Wall Street, or the south side of Chicago, or Roxbury, Massachusetts, or Harlem. You had large areas where the black middle class and upper class was beginning to really shape the cities that these communities were in, but also the larger African American experience. So I think what's important about the black experience in the Gilded Age is, while it was true that a large number of people in the South continued to suffer under tremendous racial oppression, even in the face of this, there was a lot of advancement within the black community, particularly in that middle class, in the business class, as it worked within a segregated system to develop its own success and its own economic opportunities. And this is an important narrative that needs to be added to the Gilded Age. So just as immigrants were fighting against a certain amount of discrimination, blacks were facing a good deal more, and even despite this, were able to make something of themselves as a community and as individuals. So what I want you to do is to write a little something about this, about the themes covered here, and I look forward to seeing what you have to say.